Hello, this is an introduction to keyshot. On the left here we have the library panel. This is sort of like a restaurant menu where you can order up different options for your rendering. In the middle we have our viewing window where you will see your model and the changes that you make. And on the far right you have the project panel, which this records sort of your menu choices and allows you to make further changes and tweaks. At the top and the bottom we have toolbars. The really one thing to pay attention to in the top toolbar is your CPU usage. You just want to make sure it's not at 100, as this can cause your computer to crash or the keyshot program to crash. But before we get much further, let's start by importing a file. You can click the import option here. I'm going to bring in a toaster assembly and click open. I tend to leave all of these settings to default and just click open, or sorry, import. And if you're getting an error here, you can always save your files out as step files from SolidWorks. This is a more universal 3D file and can bring it in for you if you're getting an error. Now, once the file is in here, we can see in our project panel that the model set has updated with the name from SolidWorks. Clicking on the plus expands these menus and shows all the different parts and bodies that have been brought in. This can be useful to hide them, clicking on the eyeball, in order to see the different parts that we need to apply materials to that we can always turn on later. Sometimes this needs to be reorganized. Let's say you have a surface in SolidWorks that you used for construction. You might need to come in here and select it and hit delete. If you make too many changes to this model set within here, it can make updating from SolidWorks a little bit more problematic. It's not to say to not do that, it's just to be aware of it. So if I start renaming these and I change my design in SolidWorks and re-import the file, there's now an option to update geometry. This works better if this is not messed with as much. Just be aware of that. Now that we have our file in here, we can talk about some navigation within the viewing window. So if I click on my left mouse button and drag around, I tumble the model. If I scroll on the wheel in the middle of my mouse, I zoom in and out, and if I press down on the scroll wheel, it is a panning option. For workflow, keyshot lays it out in the way they intend you to go through. So you start with your materials, then you set up your camera, then you set up your environment and your lighting. This is more or less the workflow that I use. There's a little bit in back and forth once you have everything set up. So starting with materials, a material that I like is plastic, hard, and either shiny or rough. These are basically the same. There's in fact a slider on the material that I'll show you later that basically can tweak between the two of them. And to apply a material, you can just simply select it from the menu and click and hold and drag and let go onto a body in here. And you'll notice that this is a handle file. There's two separate bodies, but because it's one part file from SolidWorks, keyshot combines the two materials together. Now you can unlink the materials by simply right-clicking and saying unlink material. And now if I click and drag a different option, you can see that it changes. Another way to apply material is simply to shift and left-click and then to copy, and then shift, and still holding shift, right-click to paste. And now if I believe those are all tied together, so now if I make this back red, it will change the other ones as well. As far as different materials to use, under metals, I like aluminum. Under basic, there's this rough aluminum that's just like a sort of generic shiny metal. I'm now using that shift copying trick to carry it over to the cap and the bezels. But certainly there's plenty of other options in here, if you're going for a slightly different aesthetic. There's lots of options to match the look you're going for. There is Axalta paint. These have sort of nice lighting qualities, but the color is pretty much set as is. If you want some metal that is similar to this, but you have more control over the color, the anodized aluminum works a little bit better for this. I believe if you double click on this, we can start to edit some of these material choices. So here, if I, in the property manager on the right, or sorry, project panel, I can click on color, and if I select this swatch, I can drag this around and dial in something a little bit different than the defaults that are offered. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply just a bunch of materials to these different parts. Maybe I'll make the rack a shiny aluminum. If I drag a rough aluminum onto something else, it's going to ask me if I want to link the materials. If I say yes, that means that if I change any of the other materials on the outs, if I change one of the bodies, it will match it to both of them. So just be aware of that. But right now I'm just going to leave it as this basic rough aluminum. For this inside material, or the burner, if I double click on this, this is another way to edit materials. So this is sort of the default from SolidWorks. So I double clicked on this sort of heating element here, and it brings up my materials property in the project panel. I can choose this drop-down menu here, and there's a lot of different default options that I can then go in and edit. So for example, I could change this to be an emissive or a lighted option. Here we go, emissive option. And if I change this to like an orange, it might make it look like the burners are on and glowing and giving off some light. So it depends sort of the render that you're going for. Now don't forget that I hid the door before. If I turn it back on, obviously we can't see the inside. For some of the clear materials, there's two options. There's clear plastic, but I find that default glass gives a slightly better result, and in this case solid glass, because we have a thickness to this door. So I'm just going to choose one of these defaults. Let's try solid black and see how that looks. All right, and those are some material basics. Next up, we have the camera. So here we can sort of click and tumble, and I like to set up sort of a classic hero view, a 3/4, where we can clearly see the top, front, and side of our object, just to give a good understanding of what we're looking at for the viewer. There are some settings in here. It defaults to perspective being on. It has a pretty high perspective focal length at 50. I think if you dial this to 35, it just makes it a little bit more dramatic. It ups the perspective just a bit. I wouldn't go any lower than this though. You can play with some depth of field options here if you want some blurriness in the background, but I think for this project clarity is better, so I wouldn't mess too much with that. As far as the environment goes, this is the default environment. It's okay, but it's pretty bland. There's not a lot of punch to it. So as far as default environments go, in this studio option, I like the panel options. And you can simply, I think, double click this and it will load it, or click and drag. Now you'll notice that it changed the background to match the scene, and I find that distracting. So often here in my environment tab under settings, I'll change the background not from the lighting environment, which is the default, to a color. Now I typically leave it white, but you want to be aware of areas where it's sort of blown out and we lose the edge of the object. Some people like to come in here. I've seen it sort of trendy to match the render to sort of the color of the object to maybe like a pastel in the background. This is all to to your preference. Again, the main thing to be aware of is anything blown out and lost on this edge here. Now the way you can fix things like that is by rotating the environment. So you can click and drag this around to kind of move where that highlight is, or simply hold down Control and drag to move this. And sometimes it's also just simply a materials thing. This top of this object is really blown out. If I go, and this is where I'm saying workflow might be back and forth. If I go back and choose, an Exalta paint, I guess that didn't. I guess it's still blown out. But depending on how glossy your material is, you can sort of tweak that and change it. But yeah, so it's sort of lighting and materials kind of go hand in hand together. A better option than choosing materials in order to match your lighting is actually to set up your own custom scene. Now you can have multiple environments here and toggle between them. So Setting up your own lighting environment is probably the best way to get exactly what you want and is my preferred method. So there's a couple options here as starting points. You could use one of these gradients, or sometimes I often like this all black starting point. And what I'll do is I'll simply click this and drag it over here. And you can see again, you can toggle back and forth. We can see here the burners are still giving off sort of that emissive light. Now, once you are setting, or to set up your own custom scene, I click on this HDRI editor, and this brings up an option to add spotlights and different lighting options. So I'm going to first start by clicking on a pin light, and you'll notice here that it automatically loads an option to click to add highlight and to position it. For some reason this doesn't load for you, it's this icon right here. The first light I tend to place on like the top right corner. I just think it gives a nice sort of product highlight and a good starting point. Now you can certainly play with the lighting options once you have it placed. You can play with the size of the light. So here it's a default radius of 30. I can turn that to 60. I can play with the brightness and really tweak, exactly how I want this to look. Now, as far as the rest of the lighting goes, I try to keep it pretty basic. I wouldn't overdo it. I think you should be able to do this with 3 to 4 lights. Anything more than that starts to get kind of muddy and confusing. And I tend to follow a standard 1, 2, 3 lighting technique, with 1 being the brightest surface, that would be the top of the toaster, 2 being probably the front and being the sort of the middle brightness, and then 3 being the darkest, and in this case probably the side. Now this first light is sort of serving as our number 1 light. I think I'm going to load another pin, and again this time the click to place did not automatically load, so I'm going to click on this icon and click somewhere like on this handle, and actually that was really nice. It gives us a nice sort of shadow across this front glass, gives us some nice reflections on the handle here. So sometimes it's just like clicking around to get something you like. And honestly, like this is pretty close. In this case, it looks like this front face is more of the 1 and this is more of the 2. It's sort of to your own preference. Again, I'm glad that this edge is still picking up. It helps us read the object. So I'm going to click done and maybe do one more and click on the side here. And so that's really bright. I'm just going to go down here to this brightness and turn it down to 0.2 and see if we can just, maybe that's too dark, maybe 0.4. And yeah, get something close. Obviously this is something that you can spend a lot of time on and fuss to your heart's content. And it's sort of a rabbit hole that's easy to get lost down. So, find something that makes your object look good and that suits sort of your desired aesthetic. Now, once we have that, I forgot to mention that on this camera setting, if you click on the Add New Camera, it creates recorded information of the exact angle that you're viewing it at, the focal length that you set, and you can always come back to this. So if I go back to my free camera and tumble here, if I click back on camera 1, it will snap back to this. So certainly that is an important step to make, especially once if you've taken the time to set up a custom environment. You want to lock your camera so that you can see your object ideally. Let's see, other things I forgot to mention on the scene tab. If you select the toaster here, you can reposition the object with this setting here. Maybe the most important thing to know here is the snap to ground. Keyshot and SOLIDWORKS are pretty good at bringing this in automatically snapped to the ground, but if for some reason your object came in and it looks like it's floating, you can click on the move tool and position it yourself until it looks right, or you can simply click snap to ground, in which case it'll take the lowest point on your model and put it on the ground plane and make it look like it's sitting on that floor and make it look right. As far as lighting goes, I don't mess with this too much. I tend to leave this at basic. There is product mode that can sometimes help, but I find that sometimes it adds all these little like speckles of dots of light, and those kind of I find distracting. Let's see. In terms of image, this is another place I don't mess too much with. I have heard some advice that photographic will give you better render qualities. I think it just takes a little bit longer to render. You can see that the image changes slightly. These are things you can play with. I would definitely click on background color here. You can see without it, it has this kind of like soft gray. So these are some lighting options that you can play with. The main thing here too, though, is you want to make sure that self shadows is checked on. I think with this off, the object won't cast shadows onto itself, so sometimes you get some weird lighting effects. In terms of the environment and settings, this is also where you can turn ground shadows on and off. I would definitely leave those on. Those are all of the basics. Again, there's like a bit of back and forth, you know, where I might come back now and mess with my materials now that I have my lighting and objects set. And again, or maybe it's just like a matter of, you know, sort of preferential fussing of the kind of aesthetic that you're going for, or matching a certain brand look or image. Now, if you are doing that, a good way to change the way an object looks is on your scene tree here. So there's these double chevron, double arrows. If I click on this, I can create more model sets. So this is a good way to play with different material loadouts. So if I click on this add model set icon, it's a bunch of these shapes. I can give it a name, click on OK, and now I have a slightly different model set, and I can once again sort of play with the colors. And what I can do then is toggle between the two options, you know, depending on what it is that you want to set up. Another way to do this, a slightly deeper dive, is to load the Studio tool. And that is under Window and Studios. And you can see some of these hotkeys here. And this is basically very similar to these model sets, but you can also, it can also remember like the lighting environment that you have. And it can even toggle between materials. So if we go back to the burner here, let me find the door and hide it and double click on this burner. I can create a multi-material here. So there's one emissive option. If I click on this again, maybe I want an option where it's off and it's just sort of like a dull orange plastic, you know, that's not giving off any light. So maybe that's what it might look like with it off. Now if I go back to my Studio key here, if I check this, I can then set whether I want it to be on or off. And this is a quick way to sort of toggle between different renderings or different scene sets. Let's see here with this model set, maybe I want the default one on. So this is just sort of a deeper way of file organization. For me though, in my personal workflow, I only tend to use these model sets. The Studio is a bit, I really only use it if it's like complex renders and such that I need to set up multiples of. Now as far as rendering goes, there is the render tab down here. Now frustratingly, keyshot always exports renders to the keyshot folder. So just be sure to remember to change this. I'll tend to just put this on my desktop or choose my project folder that I'm working out of. Different options here, so either JPEG or PNG. PNG is nice because you can it can render it transparent, so anything white is going to be transparent. The shadows will render as like a partially transparent, so that's nice for putting it into presentations and stuff. As far as resolution goes, you know, you can see here the print size matching. You can match this if you need to print it. Again, you want to print something at like 300 or 200 DPI. And I think it can update this. So let's say I'm doing like an 11 by 17. It can just do that math for you. My default is I tend to do the largest dimension at about 3,000 pixels. It depends on the amount of time you have. As far as layers and passes go, a clown pass will put every single body out as a purely saturated color. This can make selection easier in Photoshop if you're doing some post-editing. Options here, for samples, this is going to affect your render quality the most and your time. So, the default here is 68. I think that's pretty good. Um, I don't know. Some others might have a lower default. I've seen, I know some students have, they go at like 112. I think anything sort of in this middle here is good. Um, and yeah, simply once you're ready to render, once you've tweaked these settings, you can simply hit render and it will start to calculate it. Another thing that's worth being aware of is the region render. So if I check this box, this is a good way to like look if you're trying to really dial in a specific material or area. You can crop close in to look at something. That way it doesn't have to render the whole image. You can just get a quick sense. Some people, their workflow will be, in fact, to start with this small region render just to verify that all their materials and stuff look good before setting up their render and letting it cook, and then realizing that it doesn't look how they wanted. You'll notice that my camera was tumbling around. I did not mean to do that. So clicking back on this camera can load it. If you don't want to move your object accidentally, you can always click on that lock there. Another thing you can do is you can queue your renders. So let's say you want to do multiple renders and walk away from your computer. I can click Add Job. And again, maybe I go to my scene tree here and load my other colorway with the burners off, and maybe I can click Add Job. And now, so it'll output both of these renders to the file location that I mentioned. And yeah, I think that's about everything you need to know as an introduction to Keyshot.